Perfect.
Absolutely. Yes. I'll give you a very clear cue.
Correct. That's all. I was making sure I don't leap in when I'm not supposed to.
It's all good. All right, here we go. Welcome. My name is Anderson Cook, coordinator for Read SC, the South Carolina affiliate Library of Congress Center for the Book. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I want to make sure all attendees know that we do have closed captions available. At the bottom of your screen, there is a CC icon that will show you closed captions if you're interested in a live transcript. Tonight, we are actually fortunate to have two authors in conversation. Our featured author, Kristy Woodson Harvey, will be interviewed by Cindy Burnett. After their interview, we should have time for a few questions, and there is a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. If you click that button, the chat box will pop up on the right side of the screen and allow you to type in any questions that you have. Please feel free to enter questions at any point during tonight's talk. So a little bit about Cindy Burnett. She is the host of the Thoughts from a Page podcast, where she interviews authors about their latest works. An avid reader and book reviewer, Cindy loves to talk about books everywhere she can. In addition to hosting her podcast, she actively promotes books she loves on social media, including Instagram and Facebook. And she also writes 2 columns for the Buzz magazine, Buzz Reads, and Page Turners, and reviews for monthly institutions like thebookreporter.com. A little bit about our speaker, who is featured tonight, Kristy Woodson Harvey. She is the USA Today best-selling author of 7 novels, including Feels Like Falling, the Peachtree Bluff series, and Under the Southern Sky. A Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude graduate of the University of North Carolina of Chapel Hill's School of Journalism, her writing has appeared in numerous online and print publications, including Southern Living, Traditional Home, USA Today, Domino, and Oh Kristy. Kristy is the winner of the Lucy Bramlett Patterson Award for Excellence in Creative Writing and a finalist for the Southern Book Prize. Her work has been optioned for film and television, and she has received numerous accolades. And in order for us to have time for her to answer the questions that I'm sure all of us will have, I want to go ahead and pass it off to Cindy and Kristy. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Anderson. So, well, Kristy, I'm looking forward to speaking with you this evening about Under the Southern Sky. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being here, Cindy, and for interviewing me. And I just have to just say right at the very beginning, I just want to make sure that everyone knows about your amazing podcast and how they can find you. So will you tell them about that really quickly?
Oh, absolutely. So I launched a podcast last June, and I interviewed, Kristy was one of my early interviews, and I interview authors and others in the publishing industry about their latest works and how, books are published and just sort of everything about the book world. And my website is thoughtsfromapage.com. So that's how you can find it. And I think that Anderson is going to put the link also in the chat. So, and
Megan is saying she loves your podcast and it is so fantastic. So I'm not alone. Everyone loves it.
Thank you, Megan. And before we get started, I want to say to you, congratulations on the New York Times hitting the list yesterday, number 8 too. That is just amazing, Kristy. Congratulations.
Thank you. I am so over the moon. I couldn't believe it. I was telling Cindy this backstage, but the list is coming out and you sort of have an idea, like some sales numbers have come in. So you sort of know like, okay, it's going really well or it's not, but the New York Times, like you just never know. And you could have done everything right and they still might not pick you and you just never ever know. So I was just so nervous. And I was like, Cindy and I had an event together earlier in the day and it was such a great distraction. And then I told her that by about 3:30, I was like, I'm going to lose my mind if I don't get this phone call. Cause it's coming at like 5 or like 5:15 or so I was like panicking. And so I went to a bookstore that was like right down the street and they had a ton of books for me to sign. So I was sitting there signing books and my friends were texting me like USA Today just came out. Like there's 6 other paper bags. Like you're going to make it. You're totally going to make it. And I was like, nope, just block it out. Just block it out. And people were calling to try to distract me from, and then we found out number 8. So I can't believe it. I'm so excited. And I said this morning to some of my author friends that, there are things that you work really hard for and then you get them and you're like, that wasn't as great as I thought. Like this was as great as I thought it was going to be. Just because I mean, it's my 7th book and I've worked really, really hard. And I'm so grateful for, all the readers and people like Cindy who have, just helped get my books in front of people. And that's what it is. It's just year after year, like a little more and a little more and a little more, and you finally get there. So it was very exciting. And thank you for all your support.
Oh, of course. It's super exciting. And to come in at 8 also, I mean, that's just, I was so excited the second I saw it. I was like, oh, yay, congratulations. So that's wonderful. Now we can all call you the New York Times bestselling author, Kristy Woodson Harvey.
Forever and always. Like I don't even have to do it again, right?
Exactly. It sticks with you forever. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about Under the Southern Sky? I usually ask authors to just start talking about their book a little bit so that people that haven't read it can hear a little bit about it, and then we'll delve into some other questions.
Yes. So I have to tell you something fun. I'll tell you about Under the Southern Sky, but I just did a book club for Feels Like Falling, which was my 2020 book. And I have talked so much about Under the Southern Sky the last few weeks. And like, I just wasn't, and I jumped off an event and then jumped right onto this book club. And I was sitting there and I was like, what is Feels Like Falling about? Like, what are the characters' names? I don't even remember how to talk about this book. So it's really funny how you can just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about a book. And then it's like, what did I write other things? What were they about? Anyway, it was really funny. But,
well, and the publishing industry is so funny too, because while you're in the middle of this book coming out, you've got your next book's coming. So you're toggling between sometimes 2 and 3 and 4 books. So
well, and there were a couple of like secondary characters in Feels Like Falling. And I was like, I'm just going to have to like dodge that because I cannot remember that guy's name. Like, can't remember. It's terrible. But anyway, but Under the Southern Sky, the book that we are on that I do remember very well, is a story about an investigative journalist named Amelia, who is working on a story about what people do with their leftover frozen embryos after IVF treatments. And she inadvertently comes across something that she should not have seen in a doctor's office, which is a list on his desk of embryos that have been deemed abandoned, which means that no one is paying for their storage, and what could happen to them is kind of up in the air. So she knows that she has to tell her friend Parker about this, but he is just very much still in the depths of despair about his wife passing away 3 years earlier. And she knows this is going to be a setback for him. So she really dreads kind of having to be the one to tell him. But of course she does. And then Parker has to decide what he's going to do with what is the last remaining part of this woman that he loves so much. And so the story is told from the perspective of Amelia and of Parker, and of Parker's late wife, Greer, and Amelia's good Southern meddling mama, Elizabeth, who plays a pretty big role in this story as well. And so each of these characters has a secret, and we see those secrets sort of unravel one by one. And as they do, what ultimately happens to these embryos is determined.
Well, it's such an interesting subject matter and not something you really see in stories a lot. How did you come up with that?
Well, thank you for asking. And sometimes, this is a good one because sometimes I'm like, I honestly don't know. It just sort of popped into my head. And there are a million little things I think that contribute to any story. And I can look at like lots of little things that happen in this book and think about like, oh, that was because of that, or this was because of this, or, whatever it may be. But I think the initial spark for this story came a few years ago. I was at a party, and a friend who had just had twins via IVF came up to me and she said, my husband and I are trying to decide what to do with our leftover embryos. And she said, we just never thought about this. We were thinking about our family, and we were thinking about, how we were going to have these babies. And, when you go through a process like this, you have no idea if the embryos are going to take, or if you're actually going to get pregnant, or, how many you're going to use, or how many you're going to have left over. And so for them, they had tried this process a couple of times and it hadn't worked. And so, this just wasn't, they were just thinking about their babies. And she said, now we're so attached to them. Like they feel like the siblings of our children, but do we have all these other children just because we don't want to get rid of the embryos, or, what do we do? And she said, a lot of people are going to be going through this, and I think you should write a book about it. And I knew I would. Like right then I thought that's a great idea. That's definitely a topic that I want to tackle, which is interesting for me because I would definitely tell you that I'm not an issue-driven writer. I think all of my books have issues in them that come up as a part of the story, but I've never gone into a book saying, I'm going to write a story about, the effect of alcoholism on motherhood, or, whatever it may be, like things that might have come up in my other stories, but I never really meant them to be sort of issue driven in that way. And so I really didn't want to go into a book that way either. So I knew I needed to find a story. And more importantly, I needed to find a story that people were going to care about, because, this is a very fraught issue. Some people think it's just a few cells, it's no big deal, just get rid of them. Some people think they should all be donated to science and we should be doing research on them. And for some people, like, they are children, they are life. So it's a very fraught subject. And I didn't want half of the people who picked the book up to be like, who cares about this? So I knew that I had to raise the stakes on this story somehow. And so I figured, just right off the bat, that having one of the parents of these embryos, having one of them pass away would be the real way to raise the stakes, because it is the last remaining piece of a person that's no longer there. And, we know single mothers, we see single mothers. That's something that we are used to in our culture, and something that we are accustomed to seeing. And so I really thought, we need a story about a single father. So fast forward, and Lies and Other Acts of Love had come out. My whole Peachtree Bluff series had come out. Feels Like Falling, my novel from last year, was sort of signed, sealed, delivered. It was in, it was ready to go. And I knew I needed to start thinking about my next book. And I had been talking about this story idea, about these frozen embryos, and, this was what I was going to write my next book about, but I didn't really know the story yet. And so a friend was in PA school, and she called me on the phone one day and said, I have been dying to get out of the hospital because I had to call you and tell you. She had just delivered her first baby, and it was via a surrogate, and the father of the embryo's wife had died 5 years earlier, and he decided to have their baby with a surrogate. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, that's my story, and it was something that, it was sort of like something that I had been imagining, but just to know that, like, that was real, and that had happened to someone, and to kind of, for it to be like this tangible thing. And we actually talked about it. Like, I was driving in the car, and she was driving the car, and I was like, and then, this has to happen, and that has to happen. And I was like, well, and obviously in my version, like, this will have to happen. And she was like, oh yeah, and it was really funny, like, how sometimes all those things just kind of like combine together to put you where you're supposed to be. And it really was such a great nod for me, because I had a lot of different things that I was thinking about that were really top of mind for me. But I'm so glad that I wrote this story now, because I feel like it's extremely timely. And, I mentioned that idea of these abandoned embryos, and that's something that is coming up a lot in the media right now, where there are somewhere, this is a huge range, but it's really hard to track. There's somewhere between 90,000 and 1 million embryos that are being cryogenically frozen, that no one's paying for their storage. And, all these doctors' offices are running out of freezer space, and it's very, very expensive. It's very, hard to kind of maintain all of these embryos. But as of right now, there's no really good solution to what they can do with them, because we're in, I think it's interesting to be in brand new territory of something, to be like, wow, this has never really happened before. What do we do? And so legally, they can't really get rid of them, because
Right.
maybe they're life, like maybe they're not. And so it's like, well, are they abandoned? Can they be adopted out? Like we would adopt out children who were abandoned. There are all these legal and ethical questions that are coming into play about what you can do with people's leftover, like, biological material that sort of no one's laying claim to. So it was a very interesting subject to get to be working on, like, as a lot of these things were unfolding, and a lot of these stories were coming out in newspapers and on the news. And I feel like there were a lot of different things like that happened that directed the course of this story as I was writing it, which was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. And it is interesting, because it's bound to be uncharted territory with IVF not being that old,
Right.
and kind of you get past the period of people trying to decide what they're going to do. And so that's interesting. And that's why I guess you're just probably beginning to see those stories in fiction then, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and, and it has been around like a really long time technically. And there was a story in the New York Times the Sunday before this book came out about a couple that did IVF like 25 years ago. And they had a child, and then they used all the rest of their frozen embryos, were trying so hard to have another child and never could. And then, like, fast forward 25 years, and the clinic found 2 more of their embryos that had been lost. And so,
Yeah, it's hard to think about that. I mean, because I can think of my friends who were first doing that, and it was about 23 years ago. So I guess it just takes enough time between when that's happening to now, like you
Well,
said.
and I guess too, like it's so prevalent now, whereas I feel like then it was something that people did, but it wasn't quite as prevalent. And I think, people are waiting longer to have children. It is a really viable option. It's something that it works pretty well. And a lot of people have done it, and like, they know their children are healthy, all those things that probably, 25 years ago were a little bit more of a question, like you were sort of taking a little bit more of a risk. And so I think that's just what's happening is, over all these years, and now with the prevalence of, so many people doing this, and, even just people, oh my gosh, like everyone I know is frozen their eggs. So just having all of these things being stored, and, what do you do with them? So it's interesting.
It is interesting. Well, another thing I really loved about your book was the setting. Like I felt like the house almost was a character in the novel, and I just loved the coastal setting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, thank you. Yeah, so the house was kind of a surprise. It was not something that I went into this novel thinking, oh, I'm going to write about this house. But um, we were actually sort of out of our house after a hurricane, and we were living in this house on the end of a peninsula in Atlantic Beach, which is very similar to the setting of Cape Carolina. It was very marshy and sort of, in a peninsula, and there were I think I've said peninsula like 30 times, sorry. But there were these live oak trees that like grew sideways toward the light. And it was just this really, really beautiful, idyllic kind of spot. And I thought, oh, I'm going to set a book like right here on the end of this peninsula. And when I started writing it, Aunt Tilly, who is Amelia's aunt and Elizabeth's sister, who appears in this story, she came on the scene really early. She was a big surprise to me. And, she was kind of a fun character to get to write. And she sort of upped the ante on this story. In fact, I pictured her living in this rambling family home, but she is a very eccentric character, and someone who I was like, she probably would not be living alone in this big rambling family home. So we'll put her with her sister and her sister's family. And they're trying so desperately to hold on to this big, beautiful house that's been in their family for, generations. And no one can really afford to keep it, but they just can't imagine letting it go. And the house itself is incredibly valuable. The land is incredibly valuable. And, if they sold it, it would change everyone's life in this situation. Like everyone would be like financially secure and could go into retirement with no worries and all of these things. But the house means more to them than any of that. And, I don't know where it came from. I don't know where the house came from specifically, but I loved writing it. And I kind of agree with you. I think the house kind of becomes a character, and, it holds all of their family memories. And I think it's actually a line in the story that this isn't a house, it's the fabric of our family woven thread by thread, memory by memory. And, those really great family homes are like that. You can go in every room and remember something great from your past or from your childhood. And I think both Elizabeth and her sister Tilly, they really need that. I think for Elizabeth, it gets her through those hard times, like sort of caring for her sister, remembering what bonds them and where they came from. And then she worries a lot about, her sister has sort of a very loose grasp on reality. And she worries that if she takes her out of the environment that she's always known, that will get worse. And so there are a lot of really strong reasons. Not to mention that Elizabeth's best friend, Olivia, lives beside them on this peninsula, which is like a childhood dream of theirs, that they would be neighbors. And but I'm also, I love houses. I'm always very interested in them. My mom and I have a design blog called Design Chic, where we write about, interiors and homes and all those things. So I do think that they play an important role in the story, but this one in particular, for sure.
I always love books like that. I feel like when you have such a strong sense of setting, of place, it just makes the book even stronger. And so I just love that about it. And I do love your blog too, and your Instagram post. I always look at all those different beautiful homes and rooms that you post, and I'm like, oh, I wish mine looked like that.
Me too. You are not alone.
Well, what about a highlight? Did you have a highlight of writing this one?
Oh, that's such a good question. This is this was one of those books. I mean, I think there's some books that you look back on and you were like, oh, that was a struggle from minute one. This one was just easy in some ways, but there were like a lot of weird things going on around it. So for one thing, I had pitched this idea to my editor, who I absolutely loved. We had done 4 books together. I knew this was going to be a little bit of like a bigger book for me, just in terms of it was going to be a lot more plot heavy. There were a lot more characters. There were, I mean, I had tackled some serious issues before, but I felt like this was maybe a bigger part of a story than I had done before. And so I was really kind of buoyed by the idea that, you know, she would be there with me for this process. And if I needed anything, like I knew I had someone I really trusted that was going to be alongside me in this process. And then she ended up not being my editor for reasons that neither one of us could have predicted. And so, you know, that happens a lot in the publishing world, that, you know, editors move on, you know, and different things happen. So I had a new editor and I was so nervous about it. And so I just thought, well, you know, I'm in this situation, I've sold the book. So I wrote the book and I was really proud of it. Like I thought, you know, I'm proud of this work. I'm, you know, I'm excited that I did this. And I think it worked out. And I remember like going to my first editorial meeting, you know, and this was back before COVID, when we could go to New York and sit in these big boardrooms and have 20 people at a table and eat cake, you know,
Together.
And yeah. And it was the first time that I had met this new editor in person, and we were talking about Feels Like Falling. We were not there to talk about Under the Southern Sky, but she actually walked in the boardroom with everyone sitting there, like the president and the vice president and everybody. They were all sitting there, and she walked in and she was like, I know we're here for Feels Like Falling. And she was like, but this book. And then she just started saying these things that like were these little tiny details in this story that I think, you know, you don't necessarily pick up on. Like they were important to me as the writer, but I don't necessarily expect for the reader to be like, oh, you know, that part, like you might just think, oh, la, la, whatever. You're just reading the book really quickly. And so that really was like a super cool moment for me, because I was like, okay, this all worked out. Like she gets this book, and, you know, I know she's gonna like help me get it to the place where it really needs to be. And so that's always a really good feeling. And so I do think that was a highlight of like, just for a number of reasons. I mean, I was obviously, it's never fun to lose an editor that you really love, but it was also really great for me to know that I could go from an editor that I really loved to another editor that I really loved. And they might push me in different ways, because she pushed me. And I said to her, I was like, I want you to push me on this story. Like, I don't want you to just, you know, let stuff go. Like, I really want to work on this and make it as good as it can be. And so she definitely pushed me, and I'm so glad that she did. And I think, you know, all of, you know, the input that ended up happening on this story, you know, really did make it a lot stronger. And so, so that was definitely a highlight. But I also, it's been really well received so far. And that means a lot to me, just because you don't know. I mean, you can love something and put it out and people don't like it, or it just doesn't resonate with them for whatever reason. And so anyway, it's been a really good, I mean, it hit the New York Times list. Like, can we talk about that? That's a highlight of writing the story. Forget all that other stuff I said.
A starred Publishers Weekly review too.
Okay, you're right. Yes. And it was my first starred review in Publishers Weekly, which was hugely exciting. No, so it's been a really great book to write. I mean, it really was. But all of that to say, the story was it was one of those books that I look back and I'm like, that was really fun to write. It was really fun to edit. I never felt panicky about any of it. And even though like the story didn't end up going the way I thought it was going to, but that was fine. Like I was like, it's fine. It's not going to go that way, but we're going to go this way instead. And this is all going to be okay. So it was like pleasurable to write. And I think it was, you know, an escape for me to get to write it. And so, you know, it's one, I know that I'll always look back on this one and be like, yes, that was a really fun one to write. And maybe there's something to that there's ones that you feel like come sort of easily. Maybe there's a reason for that.
No, I think that is exactly right. And so Anissa in the chat says, who is your favorite character to write in this one? And who is your favorite character in all of your books?
Playing favorites, Anissa. Gosh, that's like, who's your favorite child? That's a dangerous question. I'm just kidding. Um, let's see. This is going to be a weird answer, but in Under the Southern Sky, I loved writing Greer, and we only get to see her through her journal entries. But I think that's what I liked about it so much, because I love writing those introspective parts of a character. Like, I'm one of those writers that I have to be like, okay, like, she's thinking too long, put her back in the scene. I have to like keep myself like from getting people out of the story too much. And so I think that was so fun for me, because like, that was all it was. I was in her head that whole time. We didn't have to have a ton of, you see like a little bit of dialogue here and there, like in her journal entries, like, well, he said, and I said, and whatever. But she was really fun for me to write. I also really loved writing Aunt Tilly, just because I think she's one of those like gray area characters where she's super eccentric. She was really fun to write. And you're like, how much of this is real? How much of this is an act? Like, what's happening here? So she was fun to write too. But my favorite character ever. I mean, this is going to be a funny answer, because this is by far the most controversial character that I've ever written. I loved writing Caroline in the Peachtree Bluff series. Like, she just is totally unfiltered. She says whatever she thinks. Like, she is not nice. And I mean, she can be. She has a really big heart. Like, she loves everyone. And she like wants them to be like their very best self. And that's why she's so snarky and whatever. But I loved writing her. And she is the character that I have gotten the like, that's the best character you've ever written emails. And the ones like, I can't believe that you wrote a character like that. But I think it was, she was just someone that was very unlike me. Like, I would never like say the things that she says or do the things that she does. And, it's like, be nice at all costs, and she doesn't have any of that. And so she was super fun for me to get to write. And, I remember talking to somebody about this story and like some ways this story could be made into other things. And I was saying to another writer, well, I've definitely gotten some, not everyone has loved Caroline. And he said, well, if you write a character that no one hates, probably no one loves them either. And I was like, what a great thing to say. And that's always sort of stuck with me, is that, you can't write, I mean, it's a character. It's not you. It's just a character. It's not that big of a deal. And, if you like them, great. And if not, fine.
I think that's so funny, because I ask that question a lot in my podcast interviews about characters that people really like to write. And people often say exactly what you're saying. They love writing the snarky character, or the really honest character, or the really evil character, because it's so different than they are. And so that, it's just really fun to do something different than you're doing yourself.
And, in Slightly South of Simple, like, that's the book that she's like the main protagonist in. I had such a short deadline on that book, and I didn't have a ton of filter on that book, because I just had to write it. And I look back now and I'm like, if I had more time with it, I probably would have softened her a little bit. But I don't think that anyone would have emailed me and said, that's the best character you've ever written, if I had softened her, because she would have not been as authentically herself. And then even, when the mass market paperback came out, I get the opportunity. I can go back and make any changes that I want to any character that I want to. And I really didn't. Like, there was maybe like one thing that I took out of hers that I was like, oh, maybe that's a little too harsh, but I really kind of left her, because I was like, well, she is who she is.
Well, and I mean, obviously she's resonating with people.
Yeah.
So Megan's asking, I also enjoyed reading about some of the other characters, including Martin, Philip, and Sherry. Any potential prequel or sequels about these characters?
Oh,
And
I
then
love them.
lots of people were saying how much they like the journal entries. There's
Oh, thank
lots of people popping in
you.
with that.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, you know what? That's such a good idea. That is not something that I do. Like, I just have not like taken secondary characters and then made them into main characters, but I don't know why. I mean, yeah, I think there's definitely anything. Look, I said for 3 years I wasn't going to write any more Peachtree Bluff, and Christmas and Peachtree Bluff's coming out October 26th. So now I'm just going to say anything is possible, but I did love this story. And if I was going to write a sequel to anything, like, this would be the book that I would write a sequel to. So,
what about putting out books during the pandemic? You have the an enviable position of saying you now have had 2 books come out during the pandemic. So do you want to talk a little bit? I mean, obviously, last April compared to this April is drastically different, but do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So last April was super scary. Well, I mean, it was super scary just to be living in the world and like, oh my gosh, we have this, virus taking over the world. So it was terrifying for a number of reasons that had nothing to do with launching a book, but it was also scary because I very much was and am someone who I go on tour, I speak to people, I sign their books, and that's how I sell books. I mean, I sell a lot of books by being on tour. And so it was very nerve-wracking for me, especially when Feels Like Falling came out, to think, how do we do this and how do we pivot? And, I do think, people like you, Cindy, were really good about, just jumping in right away and saying, we're going to do this differently. We're going to move everything online. A lot of people were really not able to make that change and to make that happen so quickly. So, it was definitely different. I will say, probably one of the best things that came out of it was Friends and Fiction, which for those of you who don't know is a weekly web show and podcast that I do with 4 other writers, Mary Kay Andrews, Kristen Harmel, Patty Callahan Henry, and Mary Alice Monroe. And we go live on Wednesday nights at 7, and we interview lots of different authors, and it's a really fun show. It's a really good time. And it kind of, gave us a whole new audience, I think, and viewership during the pandemic, like where we were really able to reach people in a different way, just in a very similar way to doing all these virtual events. So that was a huge gift that came out of it, and something that, has moved forward and carried on and has still been a really, really great thing, to be able to kind of fall back on and to still have, like, during this year of launching this book and still in a pandemic. I've been really lucky because I was able to go out on tour a little bit. Some of the publishers just said, absolutely not, no way, we're shutting down all tours. Mine said, we can't pay for you to go on tour because then we're like endorsing it. But if you would like to go on tour and there are places who want to have you come on tour, then, we're okay with it. So that was great because it just was so nice to be able to get back out on the road. And, there are a lot of places, I think, especially, in the South, where the numbers are pretty good and a lot of people have been vaccinated. And that was what started happening. We thought we were going to be canceling the whole tour. And then, we would call all these different places and they would say, well, would you consider coming if we only had X number of people? And, so many of our people have been vaccinated and they really want to get back out to these luncheons and that kind of thing. So it was a really good experience to be able to get to go back on tour and get to see people. It was a very abbreviated tour. I think I did maybe like 2 weeks of tour events or something. And they were all places I could drive, which was great. I didn't get on any airplanes or anything like that. But so it's definitely been very, very different to be able to launch this year versus last year. And everything's just felt very different. But I think there's so many things that we learned during a pandemic launch that we will continue on. I mean, the podcasts and Friends and Fiction and, the things that have really worked, I think we'll probably keep doing. And I think things will move to a little bit more of a hybrid. Like we'll be doing some in person, we'll be doing some virtual, and it kind of makes it great, not only for people who, can't get out and come to these events, but also, we can be in a lot more places at once and we don't have to, go all over the country necessarily. I mean, I miss that, but, but it is really nice. So I think there are a lot of things that we'll kind of keep from this COVID year.
Well, I was always amazed with the Friends in Fiction. It's such a fabulous group, and I love participating in your events and the things you all have done. That's just been wonderful. But you added me really early on. And then I interviewed Kristen, I think in September, and I can't remember what number y'all were at by then, but it was some crazy number. And I didn't realize it had gotten that big. And then when I interviewed Patty in February, and again, I mean, the growth has been absolutely explosive.
It's been staggering. I think we're across our platforms. I think we're up to like 50,000 members or something. Insane.
Yeah.
And we never expected that. Never. I mean, this was like something we were going to do as this little side project for 7 weeks until our books came out.
Right.
we thought a few people would tune in. And I mean, we never could have seen this coming, but I think that's really a testimony to the people who are in this group too, because they're just really great people, and they've gotten to be friends. It's like, it's not even really about us anymore. You know, they've gotten to be friends with each other, and we have this great Friends in Fiction official book club that's like kind of an offshoot of it. And we have this great podcast where, you know, we're interviewing people that we can't necessarily fit on the show. And so there've been just a lot of ways that it's grown. It's just been really far beyond what we ever could have imagined. But it's a game changer for all of us, especially during this time where we're really relying on things like that to meet our readers.
Oh, I think it's wonderful. Well, Megan asks, what was the favorite part of your tour? And do you ever come north for your tours? And then she says, like, maybe Pennsylvania.
Hi, Megan. Thank you. Yes, I definitely do. Oh my gosh. I definitely come north for my tours. I go all over the place. But definitely, always New York, New Jersey. So I haven't done Pennsylvania, but I will come see you in Pennsylvania. We'll have to make that happen. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, and that's something that I absolutely love, because I've gotten to see parts of the country that, I mean, I'd obviously been to New York a lot, but I had never been to like the Jersey Shore, or, you know, like there are just a million places. I'd never been to Houston and Dallas and that area. I mean, maybe once when I was little, but like, I didn't really remember it. So it's really great, you know, to get to see all these places that I wouldn't normally see. And so yeah, I'll definitely be back. In terms of my favorite tour event, let's see, you know, you hate to pick favorites, but there's this really great luncheon in Litchfield Beach that happens every year that I always love. It just brings back all these great memories, because I grew up going to the beach there with my family. And so I think there's something about that that's like kind of special. Oh, look, Anissa said her favorite tour event was Litchfield, and she came to like 4 of them. So she would know. Anissa gets gold stars. Well, for like in real life. Oh, but you know what? Okay. So speaking of events Anissa came to, I had never done an event in Greenville, South Carolina. I mean, I had done like some signings, but I'd never done like a luncheon. And that was a fantastic event. And there were so many great people. I met a lot of new readers that, you know, I never met before, which seems kind of crazy because it's not even that far away from me, but that was really fun. I had this really fantastic event in Atlanta at a store called Waiting on Martha that I love, and one in Charlotte at a store called Laura Park. And those are always kind of fun because, you know, it's not your typical like luncheon or whatever. So those were fun. They were all fun. I couldn't even pick a favorite. They were all fun. I was glad I did all of them. They were great, and I'll look forward to, I was going to say next year, but it's not next year. I'll look forward to October.
Well, and I also think people are just so happy to be out. You know, I've noticed we haven't, I mean, in Houston, people are also really vaccinated, and it's gone really well. And so people are feeling comfortable getting out, but I've only been to maybe 2 things so far. And just in terms of, you know, people setting things up, but everybody was thrilled to pieces to be together and talking about books. And so I do think that we're all just so happy to be able to do that again.
Yes. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And so speaking of that, I have a question for you, since you are, you know, interviewer extraordinaire and you're reading all the time. What are some books besides Under the Southern Sky, obviously, but what are some books that you have really enjoyed lately, or some things that are upcoming that you think people can look forward to this year?
Well, so one I read already this year, that I'm not going to do the Friends in Fiction because I know most people probably follow you, because I love all of those books. But, like Patty's book, Surviving Savannah, is one of my favorite, but I will not. Her one that is coming out in October about the C.S. Lewis and the wardrobe. My galley copy of that just arrived.
Mine did too. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah. So I'm super excited about that. And it's neat that she's launching a new imprint. I mean, that she's going to be the first book in Harper Muse's imprint.
I know. I'm so excited about that.
But earlier in the year, Erica Roebuck wrote a book called The Invisible Woman about Virginia Hall. And so it's historical fiction, and it's about Virginia Hall, who had part of her leg was amputated, and she was American, but she went over and participated as a spy in World War II. And she was in the Pyrenees, like literally crossed the Pyrenees, and with, you know, an artificial leg. And then she led all these different spy networks and was part of the SOE. So that book was fascinating. It's one of my favorite books I've read this year. I do a lot of historical
Incredible.
fiction too, in
Yeah.
addition to. So The Social Graces by Renee Rosen just came out about the big battle between Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt.
I
And
cannot wait to
ton
read
of
that. Yeah.
fun. Yeah. So it looks like we've got another question for you. Let's see here. Was your major always journalism in college, or did you switch majors? And if so, what was your original major?
I never actually switched. I did not think I was going to major in journalism, but I sort of decided, like even before I got to college, that I was originally going to major in biology and decided to major in journalism instead, which is a big difference. But I actually started out in broadcast journalism, and I mean, I really liked it. It wasn't that I didn't like it, but I wanted to be writing more, and I was like, I I need to, although in retrospect, learning how to talk on a screen probably would have been a good skill to have.
Who knew, right? Oh, well, do you want to talk a little bit before we wrap up about what you've got upcoming? I know you have your Peachtree book in the fall, and then
Yes.
you've got a neat book for next year too.
Yes, I would love to. So yeah, Christmas in Peachtree Bluff releases October 26th. It's the fourth book in my Peachtree Bluff series. It's a really feel good Christmas story. I wrote it over the holiday season, and I was writing the Christmas that I wished we were all having, to be honest. And it was so fun for me to write. It was so fun to go back to Peachtree Bluff, something that I didn't think I was going to do. And we get to see all of the women that were in the Peachtree Bluff series, just fast forwarded 3 years, and plus Vivi, who is Caroline's 15-year-old daughter. So we have a lot of very different and divergent points of view. I was a little bit, well, I didn't really have time to be like, I'm nervous about writing a 15-year-old. I just knew that's what I was going to do. And I just dove in, and it was so fun to write a 15-year-old. Like, I can't even tell you. Although it was funny because my cousin has like a 16-year-old daughter, and I had to text her a couple times and say, like, what do people call it? Like that thing, like predating, like we would call it like talking, like you were talking and then you were like going out, and I was like, what do they call it now? Do they still call it that? Because I was so afraid people would read it and be like, that is not what they call it anymore, you know? So it was funny, the things that like I had to ask her about that. But I didn't, otherwise she was really fun to write. A snarky teenager is a great character to get to be a part of.
For
Yeah,
sure.
so I'm excited for people to read it. And then in 2022, I have a book called The Wedding Veil coming out. Speaking of Vanderbilts, it's different Vanderbilts. I have not been able to find any books written about Edith and George Vanderbilt, like any novels. So the story is actually about it's about Edith Vanderbilt and her daughter with George, who's named Cornelia. And the story actually takes place after George passes away and leaves Edith with Biltmore, which is sort of an albatross around her neck at that point, because it is this massive thing to keep up. And the money that she thought was there is not necessarily there. So it's actually a story about, her wedding veil that was worn by, her mother and her grandmother and her three sisters, and then her daughter Cornelia, and then the veil disappeared. So it's a contemporary historical novel, and the veil is at the center of the story. And it's kind of my answer to maybe what happened to this wedding veil, but really it's about these four women's lives and these four very different time periods, and how, how similar they are, but also how different. So
I love any story that involves the Vanderbilts, and I love Asheville.
yes, I know. Well, I'm really excited about, getting to go back to Asheville. And I thought, if I'm going to write something historical, it's still North Carolina. It's still the South. It's not, it's not Newport. It's not New York. It's, you see a little bit of that, obviously, because that's part of their life. But I really tried to, unless I absolutely had to move it somewhere else, I really tried to keep the scenes at Biltmore. So it was fun to get to write.
Have you read The Last Castle, which is nonfiction?
Oh my gosh.
That book is so good.
It's so good. Oh my gosh, I've read it like 20 times. And what's so funny is that, I realized really quickly that so many of these like primary sources that I was using were not reliable. And there were, things that were completely made up. And of course, I'm writing fiction. So it's there, I'm making up a lot of, the meat of this story anyway, but I really wanted it to all be based on things that, happened or could have happened, or, all that. I just thought that book was like so impeccably well done that honestly, there would be things that I would read in the paper and I would sort of go back and I would say, well, it's not, I don't really think that can be true because it didn't make it into the book. So that was like just such a thoroughly researched book. And it was really great. I was actually able to go to Biltmore, sort of right as things started opening up just a little bit and talk to like some of the historians there and get some answers to some questions, as well as just some tiny little tidbits that I think really enrich the story.
And I think also when you're there, and even if you've been there before, when you're truly thinking about writing about it, to be able to integrate the details about the house, that
Yes.
you'll know they're that way because you saw it. And then one more question to come in, but from Anderson. Did you find it difficult to write about a subject some people feel very strongly about, fertility?
I mean, yes and no. Like you definitely, I mean, people have a lot of opinions about it, but I think that was kind of the impetus for finding a way to tell the story that I thought people would, care about it because, I knew that this, the mother of these embryos no longer being here kind of raised the stakes on it. But I didn't really think about it that much, honestly. I mean, I don't think there's anything in the book that is contentious or anything that, is insensitive or anything like that. I could be wrong.
No,
Sure, as I say that, I'll be getting 20 emails as soon as we get off here. But I don't think so. I mean, I think the way that the subject is approached, it's not contentious, and it's not an ethical debate of, what should you do or what should we do or what's the right thing to do. It's none of that. And actually, honestly, you sort of see perspectives of all of those things. Like this character thinks this and this character thinks that. And there's just no right or wrong, really. I mean, it's just sort of what you think. So, and I think it's really easy to kind of judge that situation from the outside when you're not in it. And so I really just wanted to hear from the people who were in it.
And then Anderson has another question. How do you think the book might have changed had it been set elsewhere? Sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely if it wasn't set in the South, it would have been very, very different. There are a lot of opinions that come forth in the South that maybe would not be expressed or even considered in other parts of the country. And especially because this is a very traditional Southern family that has very traditional, ideas about what life is going to look like. And a lot of the things that the generation of characters that I'm mainly writing about, a lot of their choices are not things that, the older characters in the book are really on board with, but it's, so probably if it was written in a different part of the country, it would have changed. But I do think the setting, does really influence the story a lot, just in terms of, just the feel of the story and getting that kind of, almost like it's almost like sort of a throwback a little bit, like the lemonade on the church lawn and the softball games. And I felt like we needed to feel a little bit of how these characters grew up to really understand who they are as adults and why.
I think that's a good question. Well, it looks like that we've gotten through the questions, and there's Anderson, and I have loved talking with you, Kristy. This has been wonderful.
It's been so fun. Thank you so much, Cindy. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this with me. And thank you, Anderson, for having me. And thanks to everybody who came. I am really glad to see you. And I hope if you haven't read it, that you'll enjoy the book.
Thank you both so much. Cindy, you are a great facilitator. And so I'm really, really, really grateful that you were willing to kind of jump in tonight and be featured. That was such a fun treat for all of us, I think. To learn more about Kristy and purchase a copy of Under the Southern Sky, please visit her website, which I have linked in the chat box. There is also a link for thoughts from the page to learn more about Cindy and her work. And I also have linked readsc.org so you can keep track of future upcoming talks and learn more about what we do at Read SC. Thank you all again for joining us, especially Kristy and Cindy. And I hope we'll see you again soon. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.